He wasn't supposed to bark like that. The airport terminal hummed with the low, steady rhythm of rolling suitcases and distant announcements echoing through steel beams and polished floors, the kind of ordinary noise that fades into the background of American life, unnoticed and unremembered. But in that moment, something cut through it, sharp and out of place, a deep, urgent bark that didn't belong to routine, didn't belong to training, didn't belong to anything Officer Marcus Reed had heard in all his years working K-9 detail. And it came from Shadow. The German shepherd stood rigid beside him, muscles tight beneath his dark sable coat, ears locked forward, amber eyes fixed on a worn, olive-green duffel bag resting quietly near the boots of a returning soldier, a man who looked like he had carried more than just luggage across continents. Marcus felt the shift instantly, the subtle tightening in the air that most people would miss, but handlers learned to trust the silence between sounds, the pause before something revealed itself. Shadow didn't lunge, didn't snap, didn't perform the textbook alert Marcus had trained him to do hundreds of times before. Instead, he barked again, lower now, deeper, like something inside him recognized what the world could not yet see. The soldier didn't move at first, standing there beneath the fluorescent lights, shoulders squared but heavy, his duffel slung at his side like it had been part of him for years. His name patch barely visible against the faded fabric, Ethan Cole, and there was something in his stillness that felt less like patience and more like distance, like a man who had not fully come back from wherever he had been. Travelers slowed as they passed, glancing sideways, sensing the disruption without understanding it, the quiet unease that follows when something ordinary refuses to stay ordinary. Marcus stepped forward, one hand firm on Shadow's harness, feeling the tension humming through the leash, not fear, not aggression, something else, something closer to memory, and that thought unsettled him more than anything. Shadow had been trained to detect narcotics, explosives, accelerants, precise, predictable, categories of danger, but this was different. This was hesitation wrapped in urgency, a warning that carried weight without explanation. The dog let out a low, almost broken sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whine, and it made Marcus's chest tighten in a way he couldn't immediately place, because it wasn't just a signal, it felt personal. The duffel bag sat there, unremarkable to anyone else, canvas worn, zipper slightly off-center, the kind of bag thousands of soldiers carried through terminals every day, but Shadow refused to look away from it, refused to let it be dismissed, and in that refusal was a quiet insistence that something mattered here. Marcus glanced at Ethan, studying the man's face, the faint lines carved by sun and strain, the eyes that didn't flinch but didn't fully engage either, as if part of him was listening to something far away, something no one else could hear. "Sir," Marcus said evenly, keeping his voice calm, measured, the way you do when the moment hasn't broken yet but might. "Is this your bag?" Ethan's gaze dropped slowly to the duffel, then back to Marcus, and for just a second, something flickered there. Not fear, not guilt, just confusion, quiet and real. "It should be," he said, the words soft, uncertain, like he was reaching for something that wasn't fully within his grasp. Shadow barked again, sharper now, stepping closer despite the leash, his nose twitching, his body trembling in a way Marcus had never seen before, and the handler felt it then, that subtle shift from routine to something else entirely. The moment when training ends and instinct begins, when the rules you rely on no longer fit what's in front of you. Around them, the terminal continued its steady motion, announcements rolling overhead, footsteps passing by, life moving forward as if nothing had changed. But in that small circle of light around a man, a dog, and a single worn bag, something had already begun to unravel, something quiet, something unseen, something that refused to stay buried any longer. Marcus did not answer right away, because in his line of work, silence often revealed more than words ever could, and right now, the silence between the dog and the bag was louder than anything echoing through the terminal. He tightened his grip on Shadow's harness, feeling the steady pulse of tension running through the dog's body, not chaotic, not confused, but focused in a way that made his instincts sharpen. This was not a false alert. It was not even an alert in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, something older, like a memory trying to surface through muscle and bone. Shadow stepped forward again, slow this time, careful, his nose hovering inches from the worn fabric, inhaling in short, deliberate breaths. And then he stopped, completely still, as if whatever he sensed was not just present, but familiar. Marcus noticed it immediately, that shift from urgency to recognition, and it unsettled him more than the barking ever could. "Shadow," he said quietly, a single word meant to ground the dog, but Shadow did not break his focus. Instead, he let out a low, almost human sound, something that carried weight, something that did not belong in a routine inspection. Around them, a small crowd had begun to form, not close enough to interfere, but near enough to feel the tension ripple outward. A woman with a rolling suitcase slowed to a stop, her eyes moving between the officer, the dog, and the soldier. A man in a business suit pretended to check his phone, but did not look away. The ordinary flow of the terminal bent slightly around this moment, like water adjusting to a stone beneath its surface. Marcus shifted his attention back to Ethan Cole, studying him more closely now. The man's posture had not changed, but there was a subtle tightening in his jaw, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes that had not been there before. "Sir," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm, "I am going to need you to step back while we take a closer look." Ethan hesitated, just for a second, then nodded, taking a slow step away from the duffel. His movements were measured, controlled, like someone trained to remain steady under pressure, but there was something else there too, something quieter, something that did not quite fit the situation. He glanced down at the bag again, longer this time, as if trying to see it from a distance, as if trying to understand it the same way the dog was. "I packed it myself," Ethan said, almost to himself, his voice low, uncertain. "Everything in there should be mine." Marcus did not respond immediately. Instead, he crouched slightly beside Shadow, bringing himself closer to the dog's level, watching every movement, every breath. Shadow shifted his weight, his ears flicking once, then settling again, his gaze never leaving the bag. He did not paw at it now. He did not bark. He simply watched, and that stillness spoke louder than any reaction Marcus had trained him to give. It was the stillness of certainty. Marcus reached out slowly, not toward the bag, but toward Shadow, placing a steady hand against the dog's shoulder. The fur was warm beneath his palm, but the muscle beneath it was tight, coiled, like a spring held just before release. "What is it, boy?" Marcus murmured, more to himself than to the dog, because he knew better than to expect an answer in words, but sometimes the body speaks in ways the mind cannot translate. Shadow blinked once, then leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the final inch between his nose and the fabric of the duffel, and he inhaled again, deeper this time, and then he pulled back, his head tilting ever so slightly to the side, the way dogs do when something does not make sense but demands attention. Marcus followed that movement, his own thoughts beginning to shift, to align with something he could not yet fully name. This was not just about what was inside the bag. It was about what had touched it, what had passed through it, what had left a trace that Shadow could not ignore. Marcus straightened slowly, his decision forming in that quiet space between instinct and protocol. "We are going to open it," he said, his voice steady, leaving no room for debate. Ethan looked up at him, and for a moment, something passed between them, not confrontation, not fear, but a shared recognition that whatever lay inside that worn, ordinary bag was no longer just a matter of routine. It was something else now, something waiting. Marcus did not rush, because rushing was how mistakes were made, and whatever waited inside. That bag had already proven it was not something to treat lightly. He stepped closer, positioning himself between Shadow and the growing crowd, creating a small pocket of space where the moment could unfold without interference. Then he reached down and grasped the worn zipper between his fingers. The metal felt cold, ordinary, almost disappointingly so, and for a brief second, he wondered if this would all unravel into nothing more than a misunderstanding, a false signal, a story that would dissolve the moment it was opened. But Shadow shifted again, a quiet, restless movement, and that doubt disappeared as quickly as it came. Ethan Cole stood a few feet away now, his hands empty at his sides, his eyes fixed not on Marcus, but on the bag, as if he was trying to remember something that refused to come into focus. "Go ahead," Ethan said quietly, though his voice carried no challenge. only a kind of distant acceptance, like a man who had learned to let things happen because control was no longer something he trusted himself to hold. Marcus gave a small nod, more to himself than to Ethan, and slowly pulled the zipper open. The sound cut softly through the air, a low, steady glide that seemed louder than it should have been, drawing the attention of everyone within earshot. Inside, the bag looked exactly as it should, neatly packed clothing folded with military precision, a pair of boots, a rolled jacket, small personal items tucked into side compartments. Nothing out of place, nothing alarming, nothing that would justify the tension coiled in Shadow's body. Marcus paused, scanning the contents, letting his eyes move carefully over each item, not just seeing, but observing, the way years of experience had taught him to do. Everything appeared normal. Too normal. Shadow let out a soft, strained breath behind him, and Marcus felt it like a nudge, a reminder that what mattered here was not what could be seen at first glance. He reached in slowly, lifting the top layer of clothing, careful not to disturb more than necessary, and beneath it, something shifted slightly, not by movement, but by presence, something that did not belong with the rest. It was subtle, almost invisible, a small rectangular case tucked deeper in the bag, partially wrapped in fabric, the kind of object that could easily be overlooked if you were not looking for it. Marcus's hand hovered for a moment before he touched it, his instincts sharpening again, because this was where routine ended completely. He glanced briefly at Ethan. "Did you pack this?" he asked, his voice steady but quieter now. Ethan frowned, stepping forward just enough to see inside the bag, his eyes narrowing slightly as he focused on the object. "I do not remember that," he said after a moment, and there was no hesitation in his voice this time, no uncertainty, just a clear and simple truth that made the air feel heavier. Shadow let out another low sound, closer now, his nose lifting as if to confirm what his body already knew, and Marcus could feel the tension shift again, deeper, more defined. He reached in and carefully lifted the small case out of the bag. It was heavier than it looked, solid, with a matte surface that showed no markings, no labels, nothing to identify it at a glance. It was the kind of object designed not to be noticed, to blend into the background of ordinary things. Marcus turned it slightly in his hands, feeling the weight, the balance, the quiet resistance of something built with purpose. Around them, the terminal had grown quieter, conversations lowering, footsteps slowing, as if the world itself was waiting for the next move. Ethan watched closely now, his expression tightening, not in fear, but in realization, the slow understanding that something had entered his life without his knowledge. "That is not mine," he said again, more firmly this time, and Marcus believed him, not because of the words, but because of the way he said them, steady, grounded, without defensiveness. Shadow stepped closer, his body no longer trembling, but alert, focused, his eyes fixed on the case now instead of the bag, and Marcus saw it clearly then, the reason for the earlier hesitation, the reason for the strange reaction. This was not just an unknown object. It was something the dog recognized, not from training, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere older, a memory carried in. Instinct and reinforced by experience. Marcus exhaled slowly, his decision already forming as he held the case in his hands, feeling the quiet gravity of it. This was no longer a simple inspection. This was the beginning of something else entirely, something that had been set in motion long before this moment, and had now, finally, revealed itself. Marcus did not open the case right away, because something about it demanded a different kind of caution, not fear, but respect for the unknown weight it carried, and in that pause, the world around them seemed to narrow, as if the noise of the terminal had pulled back just enough to leave only the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and the steady rhythm of breathing. Shadow stepped closer again, his nose lifting toward the case, but this time he did not make a sound, not a bark, not a growl, only a slow exhale, as if confirming something he had already decided. Marcus noticed the change instantly, because silence from a trained dog often meant more than any alert, it meant certainty. He turned the case slightly in his hands, studying its edges. It seems, the way it had been sealed with precision, no scratches, no wear, nothing that suggested it had traveled openly through normal channels. It was too clean, too intentional. "Stay back," Marcus said quietly, not raising his voice, but the authority in it was enough to keep the small crowd from inching any closer. Another officer had begun to approach from the far side of the checkpoint, drawn by the shift in atmosphere, but Marcus gave a subtle signal with his hand, asking for space, for time. This was not something to rush. Ethan Cole had not moved, but now his attention was locked entirely on the case, his earlier distance gone, replaced by a focus that felt almost instinctive, like a soldier recognizing the outline of something he had once known but could not yet name. "I have seen something like that before," Ethan said slowly, his voice lower now, more grounded, and Marcus glanced at him, catching the shift in tone. "Where?" Marcus asked, keeping his eyes on the case. Ethan hesitated, just for a moment, then answered, "Overseas. Not common. Not standard issue." The words settled heavily between them, not because of what they said, but because of what they implied. Marcus adjusted his grip slightly, feeling the weight again, the balance of it, and something clicked in the back of his mind, not a full understanding, but a direction, a path forming from experience and instinct. Shadow moved his head closer, almost touching the case now, and his ears tilted slightly back, not in fear, but in recognition, the kind that comes from memory rather than training. Marcus exhaled slowly and found the small latch along the side, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look, and he paused again, just long enough to steady his thoughts. This was the moment where everything could shift, where assumption could turn into certainty. He pressed the latch gently, and it released with a soft click that seemed far louder than it should have been. The case opened just enough for him to see inside, and what he saw did not match anything from routine inspections, not a weapon, not anything immediately threatening, but a compact arrangement of components, precise, deliberate, something built with intention, something meant to do a specific job. Marcus did not reach in right away. Instead, he leaned slightly closer, studying it, letting his eyes trace the layout, the connections, the subtle details that separated ordinary from deliberate. "This does not belong in a travel bag," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Ethan stepped closer without realizing it, his gaze fixed on the open case, and then it happened, a subtle shift in his expression, not shock, not fear, but recognition, quiet and undeniable. "That is a trigger housing," Ethan said, his voice steady now, certain, and Marcus felt the weight of that statement settle in his chest. Shadow let out a low breath again, almost like a sigh, and Marcus realized that the dog had known before any of them had spoken it out loud. The pieces were starting to come together, slowly, carefully, but enough to understand one thing clearly. This was not random. This was placed. Marcus closed the case gently, his movements controlled, deliberate, and stood up straight, his mind already moving. Ahead, connecting what they had found with what it meant. He looked at Ethan again, studying him with a new lens, not as a suspect, but as someone caught in something larger than either of them had expected. "If this is not yours," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm, "then someone wanted it to be." And in that quiet space between them, the truth began to take shape, not fully revealed yet, but undeniable in its direction, pointing somewhere beyond the bag, beyond the checkpoint, towards something waiting just out of sight. Marcus felt the shift before anything else changed, the subtle tightening in the air that comes when a situation stops being contained and begins to reach outward, and it was Shadow who confirmed it, not with a bark this time, but with a slow, deliberate turn of his head away from the case and toward the wider terminal. The dog's ears lifted, catching something distant, something beyond the small circle they had created, and his body angled slightly, as if drawn by an invisible line. Marcus followed that movement instinctively, his gaze sweeping across the terminal with a new focus, no longer centered on the bag, but on the people moving through the space, the ones who were still pretending nothing had changed. It was a subtle difference, almost impossible to see if you were not looking for it, but once you did, it stood out clearly, the way one man near the far end of the checkpoint paused just a fraction too long, his posture rigid for a moment before he forced himself to keep walking. He wore a neutral jacket, nothing distinctive, nothing memorable, but his attention was not on his path. It flicked once, quickly, toward Marcus, toward the case, and then away again. Marcus felt it immediately, that quiet recognition that this moment was no longer isolated. "Stay with the bag," Marcus said softly to the approaching officer, handing off the immediate control without breaking his own line of sight, and then he shifted his stance, just enough to keep Shadow aligned with him. The dog had already begun to move, not pulling, not straining, but guiding, his steps measured, controlled, his nose lifting slightly as he tracked something unseen. Ethan noticed it too, his eyes narrowing as he followed the direction of the dog's attention, and there was a flicker of understanding there, the kind that comes from experience rather than explanation. He sees someone, Ethan said quietly, and Marcus did not answer, because he did not need to. Shadow moved forward another step, then paused, his body still but alert, and then he exhaled again, a low, steady breath that carried intention. Marcus began to walk, not rushing, not drawing attention, but moving with purpose, his path cutting gently through the flow of travelers, his eyes fixed on that one figure who had already begun to drift toward the exit doors. The man's pace had increased just enough to notice, his shoulders slightly hunched now, his movements tighter, more controlled, as if he was trying to blend into the rhythm of the terminal while quietly breaking away from it. Shadow stayed close, his focus unwavering, his body aligned with Marcus's stride, and together they closed the distance slowly, carefully, not alarming, not obvious, just present. The man reached the edge of the terminal corridor, where the bright overhead lights gave way to the softer glow near the exit, and for a moment, he hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Marcus saw it clearly now, the hesitation of someone who knew something had shifted behind him. "Sir," Marcus called out, his voice firm but controlled, carrying just enough authority to stop movement without causing panic. The man froze, not dramatically, not suddenly, but with that same controlled stillness Marcus had seen before, the kind that comes from discipline rather than surprise. Slowly, he turned, his expression neutral, almost calm, but his eyes moved quickly, scanning, calculating. "Yes, officer," the man replied, his tone even, practiced. Shadow stepped forward slightly, his gaze locked, and for the first time since they had moved away from the bag, the dog let out a single, sharp bark, not loud, but precise, like a point being made. Marcus felt the confirmation settle in his chest. This was not coincidence. This was connection. He stepped closer, closing the remaining distance, his posture steady, his presence unmistakable. "I need you to come back with me," Marcus said, his voice calm, but leaving no room for refusal. The man's eyes flickered once more, not toward Marcus this time, but past him, back toward the checkpoint, toward the place where the bag still sat, where the case had been opened, where the truth had begun to surface. And in that single glance, everything became clear. Not fully revealed yet, not spoken, but undeniable in its direction. Shadow lowered his head slightly, his body still, his focus unbroken, and Marcus realized that what the dog had followed was not just a scent, not just a signal, but a thread, one that had now led them from the bag to the man, from the unknown to something very real, standing just a few feet away, waiting to be understood. The man did not move right away, and that stillness told Marcus more than any sudden reaction ever could, because people who had nothing to hide rarely paused when asked a simple question. They complied. They asked why. They filled the silence with normal human uncertainty, but this man held the silence like it belonged to him. His eyes settled on Marcus again, steady, controlled, and for a brief moment, the terminal noise seemed to fade completely, leaving only the quiet tension stretched between them. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked, his voice calm, almost polite, but too measured, too balanced, like every word had been weighed before it was spoken. Shadow shifted slightly beside Marcus, not aggressive, not tense, but alert in a deeper way now, his head lowered just enough to keep the man in full view, his body aligned as if ready to follow wherever this moment led. Marcus stepped closer, closing the space by a few feet, enough to make his presence unmistakable, but not enough to escalate the situation beyond control. "I just need a minute of your time," Marcus replied, his tone even, steady, giving nothing away. The man gave a small nod, slow, deliberate, as if agreeing was the easiest path forward, and he turned fully to face Marcus now, his posture relaxed but not natural, the kind of relaxation that comes from discipline rather than comfort. Up close, Marcus could See more detail, the faint lines around the man's eyes, the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his hands remained visible, open, but just slightly too still. Where are you headed today? Marcus asked, not because he needed the answer, but because questions reveal more in how they are answered than in what is said. Connecting flight, the man replied smoothly. Just passing through. Shadow's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and Marcus noticed it immediately, that small, involuntary reaction, as if the tone itself carried something familiar, something tied to the scent that had drawn them here in the first place. Marcus let the silence linger for a second longer, then spoke again, this time with a slight shift in direction. Have you had any contact with a soldier named Ethan Cole today? The question landed quietly, but its effect was immediate, not dramatic, not obvious, but there, in the smallest flicker of the man's eyes, a momentary hesitation before the answer came. No, he said, just as calmly as before, but Marcus had already seen enough. It was not the word. It was the pause before it. Shadow took a single step forward, closing the distance by inches, and let out a low, steady breath, his focus locked entirely on the man now, no longer searching, no longer questioning, but confirming. Marcus felt it settle into place, the final piece aligning with everything that had come before, the bag, the case, the reaction, the glance back toward the checkpoint. This was the thread. Sir, Marcus said again, his voice firm now, carrying a different weight. I am going to ask you to walk back with me to the inspection area. The man's gaze shifted briefly past Marcus, toward the exit doors just a few yards away, sunlight spilling through the glass, the open path out of the terminal so close it almost felt within reach. And for a moment, Marcus thought he might refuse, might try to push past, might break the fragile control that had held this moment together. But he did not. Instead, the man exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, and gave a small nod. All right, he said, his voice unchanged, but something beneath it had shifted, something quieter, something that felt less like control and more like calculation adjusting to a new reality. Marcus stepped aside slightly, gesturing back toward the checkpoint, and began to walk, not turning his back, not fully, keeping the man within his line of sight at all times. Shadow moved with him, perfectly in sync, his presence steady, unwavering, a silent anchor in a moment that could have easily slipped into something else. As they walked, the terminal seemed to return to its normal rhythm around them. Conversations rising again, footsteps resuming their pace, the illusion of ordinary life closing back in. But beneath it, something had changed, something that could not be undone. Ethan Cole stood where they had left him, near the open bag, his eyes following them as they approached, and when his gaze met the man's for the first time, there was a recognition there, not of identity, but of connection, the kind that forms when two paths cross in ways neither one expected. Marcus saw it, felt it, and understood that whatever this was, it was no longer hidden. It had stepped into the light, quietly, without chaos, without force, but with a certainty that could not be ignored, and now, all that remained was to uncover the truth it carried. The walk back to the inspection area felt longer than it should have, not because of distance, but because of what now lingered in the space between each step, a quiet awareness that everything had shifted from uncertainty to something much closer to truth. Marcus guided the man to stand a few feet from the open inspection table, the duffel bag still resting where it had been left, the small case now placed carefully beside it. No longer hidden, no longer just an unknown object, but a piece of something larger that was beginning to reveal itself. Ethan Cole stood nearby, his posture straighter now, his earlier distance replaced by a steady, watchful presence, the kind that comes from years of learning to read situations that do not announce themselves clearly. Shadow moved into position beside Marcus, his body calm but alert, his gaze moving between the man and the case with quiet precision, as if tracking a pattern that only he could fully see. The man looked at the table, then at the bag, then briefly at Ethan, and for the first time, something in his expression shifted, not enough for most to notice, but enough for Marcus to recognize, a subtle tightening, a recalibration of control. I assume this is about that bag, the man said, his voice still composed, but now carrying a faint edge, the kind that appears when certainty begins to slip. Marcus did not answer directly. Instead, he He stepped closer to the table and rested one hand lightly near the case, not touching it, but making its presence unmistakable. "You told me you had no contact with him," Marcus said, nodding slightly toward Ethan without looking away from the man. "And yet your attention seems very focused on something that came from his belongings." The man's eyes flickered again, faster this time, and then settled, as if deciding which version of the moment to commit to. "I notice what is happening around me," he replied, smooth, controlled. But now there was a slight delay between thought and speech, a fraction of a second that had not been there before. Shadow shifted his weight, stepping closer to the table, his nose lowering toward the case once more, and then he paused, completely still, his ears angled slightly back, his body quiet in a way that carried more weight than any bark. Marcus recognized it immediately. This was the dog's way of saying it was here, right here, no doubt, no confusion. Marcus reached out slowly and opened the case again, this time wider, enough for both Ethan and the man to see clearly what lay inside. The components sat in precise alignment, small, deliberate, each piece placed with intention, not chaotic, not improvised, but structured, controlled. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the interior, and then he exhaled, slow and steady. "This is not something you carry by accident," he said quietly, more to Marcus than anyone else, his voice carrying the weight of experience. Marcus nodded once, then looked back at the man. "Then maybe you can explain how it ended up in his bag," he said. The silence that followed was different now, heavier, more defined, because the question no longer floated in uncertainty. It landed directly, demanding something in return. The man's gaze moved from the case to Marcus, then to Shadow, and for the first time, it lingered on the dog, just long enough to reveal something beneath the surface, something closer to recognition than surprise. That was when Marcus understood. This was not just about the object. It was about the dog too. "You have seen a dog like this before," Marcus said, not asking, but stating, his voice quiet but certain. The man did not answer immediately, but the pause itself was enough. Shadow let out a soft breath, almost like a memory passing through him, and his eyes did not leave the man's face. Ethan straightened slowly, his expression sharpening, as if a connection had just formed in his mind, something that had been waiting for the right moment to surface. "Kandahar," Ethan said suddenly, the word landing with quiet force, and the man's eyes flickered once more, not away this time, but directly toward Ethan, and in that brief exchange, everything shifted. It was not spoken outright, not confirmed in words, but it was there, undeniable, a shared history, a point of origin that connected the dog, the man, and the object now sitting open on the table. Marcus felt it settle into place, the final pieces aligning, and he knew then that whatever this was, it had not started here, not in this terminal, not with this bag, but far away, carried forward by people who thought it would remain hidden. And now, it was no longer hidden at all. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have, not because of how it sounded, but because of what it carried with it, a place, a memory, a weight that did not belong in an airport terminal under fluorescent lights. "Kandahar." Marcus did not move right away, because sometimes the most important shift in a moment happens in silence, and right now, the silence was speaking louder than anything else. The man's expression remained composed, but there was a fracture now, a hairline crack beneath the surface, the kind that only appears when something long buried is suddenly brought into the light. Shadow took a slow step forward, his body lowering. Slightly, not in threat, but in recognition, his amber eyes fixed, unblinking, as if he had finally found what he had been searching for since the moment he first smelled the bag. Ethan Cole's breathing steadied, his posture firm now, no longer uncertain, no longer questioning, but grounded in something deeper, something earned in places far from here. "You were there," Ethan said quietly, not accusing, not raising his voice, but stating it with the calm certainty of someone who has seen enough to recognize the truth when it stands in front of him. The man did not answer immediately, but his gaze shifted again, this time not avoiding, not deflecting, but settling on Ethan with a kind of measured acknowledgement. It was not confession, not yet, but it was no longer denial. Marcus watched the exchange closely, his instincts aligning with what he was seeing, what he was hearing, what Shadow had already known from the start. That case, Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. It did not end up in that bag by accident. The man exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that carried the weight of a decision forming beneath it. And for a moment, it seemed like he might hold on to the silence a little longer, like he might try to keep the moment suspended just beyond the reach of clarity. But then something shifted. His shoulders eased, just slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was still steady, but no longer distant. "It was never meant to stay with him," he said, and the words landed quietly, but with a clarity that cut through everything else. Marcus felt the tension in the space settle into something more defined, no longer scattered, no longer uncertain, but shaped by the truth beginning to emerge. Then why was it there at all? Marcus asked. The man's eyes moved briefly to the case, then back to Marcus, and for the first time, there was something almost human in the look, something that suggested more than calculation, more than control. Because he was the only one who would not question it, the man said, and Ethan's brow tightened slightly, not in anger, but in understanding, the kind that comes when pieces fall into place in ways you did not expect. Military gear. Moves differently, the man continued, his voice quiet, measured. Bags get checked, but not the same way, not always with the same suspicion. Marcus nodded slowly, the logic settling in, not as justification, but as explanation. Shadow remained still, his focus unbroken, as if confirming every word without needing to hear it. "You used him," Ethan said, not as an accusation, but as a fact, and the man did not deny it. "I used the system," he replied, and there was a subtle difference in the phrasing, one that mattered more than it seemed at first. Marcus let that sit for a moment, then asked the question that mattered most. "And what was it for?" The man's gaze dropped to the case again, and for a brief second, something like hesitation returned, not fear, but consideration, as if weighing how much to say, how much to reveal now that the path forward had already been chosen for him. "It is part of something larger," he said finally, his voice steady but quieter now. "Something that does not end here." The words did not raise alarm in the way a direct threat might have, but they carried a different kind of weight, a deeper implication that stretched beyond the walls of the terminal. Marcus felt it settle in his chest, not as panic, but as clarity. This was not just about a bag or a case. This was about a chain of decisions, a network of intent that had reached this point and now stood exposed. Shadow lifted his head slightly, his posture easing just a fraction, not because the situation was over, but because the unknown had become known, the hidden had been brought forward. Ethan stood quietly beside the table, his gaze steady, his presence grounded, and in that moment, the three of them, man, officer, and dog, stood at the center of something that had traveled far to reach them, something that had almost passed unnoticed, almost slipped through without consequence. But it had not, because one dog had refused to ignore what did not belong, and in doing so, had pulled the truth into the light. For a moment, no one spoke, and in that stillness, the truth settled into place with a quiet finality that did not need to be announced. Marcus closed the case gently, not as an ending, but as a transition, his movements calm, deliberate, as if sealing something that had already been understood. The man stood across from him, no longer resisting, no longer calculating in the same way, but present in a quieter sense, like someone who had reached the edge of a path and knew there was no further to go. Another officer stepped forward to take over, guiding the man away with steady professionalism. No raised voices, no sudden motions, just a controlled continuation of what had already begun. The terminal resumed its rhythm around them, the low murmur of travelers returning, footsteps echoing softly across the polished floor, announcements drifting overhead as if nothing had happened, as if the moment had simply folded back into the ordinary. But for those who had stood within it, nothing felt the same. Ethan Cole remained by the table, his gaze resting on the closed case for a second longer before he let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when something heavy lifts, even if only slightly. He looked at Marcus, then at Shadow, and there was something in his eyes that did not need words, something that carried both gratitude and recognition. "I did not see it," Ethan said quietly, more to himself than anyone else, his voice steady but reflective. Marcus shook his head once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "You were not supposed to," he replied, his tone calm, not dismissive, but understanding, because sometimes the system itself creates the blind spots people walk through without knowing. Shadow shifted beside him, the tension that had held his body earlier now gone, replaced by a quiet calm that felt earned. His ears relaxed, his breathing steady, his focus no longer locked onto the case or the man who had been taken away. Marcus reached down and rested a hand against the dog's neck, fingers pressing gently into the thick fur, feeling the warmth, the life, the presence that had changed everything in a matter of moments. "You did good," Marcus murmured, his voice low, not meant for anyone else, and Shadow leaned slightly into the touch, not seeking praise, but accepting it in the simple, grounded way only a dog can. Ethan watched the interaction for a second, then stepped closer, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if the weight of the moment had shifted something inside him as well. He knelt slightly, bringing himself level with Shadow, and for a brief moment, the dog looked at him, not with the intensity from before, but with a quiet awareness, as if recognizing something deeper than the situation that had just unfolded. Ethan reached out carefully, his hand hovering for just a second before resting gently against the side of Shadow's head, and the contact was simple, steady, unforced. "Thank you," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper, but it carried everything that needed to be said, not just for the bag, not just for the moment, but for something larger, something that had almost slipped through unnoticed. Shadow did not move away. He did not react in any dramatic way. He simply stayed there, present, grounded, as if understanding that sometimes the smallest actions carry the greatest weight. Marcus straightened, his eyes scanning the terminal once more, not searching now, but confirming that the ripple had settled, that the moment had passed into something quieter. Yet beneath that quiet, he knew something else remained, something unseen, something that would continue beyond this place, beyond this day. But for now, the truth had been caught before it could move further, not by force, not by chance, but by a single refusal to ignore what did not belong. Marcus glanced down at Shadow again, then back toward the path where the man had been taken, and he understood something that training alone could never teach. Some instincts are not programmed. Some warnings do not come from commands. And sometimes, the difference between what is hidden and what is found is nothing more than a dog who chooses not to look away.